I did, actually, so I UV'd this tin already. Ah, crap. I say as I hit the automatic map button. So I did UVs for like the bottom of this tin and also for the top of the tin. Does anybody have questions about these UVs, or would you like me to really quickly re-UV this can? Again, just since we didn't have class last week. Yes. Okay. Oh, so like, do another quick re-UV the thing really quick. All right. Yeah, no problem. All right. Re-UV. I actually did. So not gonna lie, I totally modeled and UV'd this morning. Theoretically, there should be videos uploading on YouTube eventually, but I'll do it here because then you can ask questions. All right. So. Gonna run through. I don't have my nice checker texture. I cry. I'm actually, that's kind of a bummer actually. Really attached to my UV checker texture. Actually, no. You know what? Give me 2 seconds. I'm gonna find the texture. Because I do think it's actually significantly easier to look at than this black and white texture. That is, for some reason, the default. Weird. Let's take it. Hey. So this is, in case anyone's wondering, this is my default, like, go-to UV checker texture. I love it. It's awesome. It makes everything better. I keep joking that, like, one day I'm like, oh, I'm totally gonna print this out as a giant poster and put it on my wall. What am I doing right now? Holy crap. Sorry. UV checker. Alright, cool. Alright, I have my checker texture. I'm gonna map this in like a real person. Break. File texture, please. Haha. It's gorgeous. Alright. So I'll just show you the bottom of the tin. And yeah, so for this, I'd pretty much just start with an automatic map, because whatever I had originally was like absolutely horrendous looking. So again, I'll turn off my resolution gate. So if you look at this, like ideally, you can totally see that there's seams here. This is actually the reason why I kind of like the checker texture, because it's easier to see the seams in the color instead of just like black and white. And you can also see, like, with these numbers and letters, you can see, like, oh, this is upside down and this is right side up. It just gives you a little more information to work with. Again, totally personal preference. So if I were to go into here, you'll see my super awesome looking automatic map UVs. They look great. So my goal with this would basically be, I'm assuming like most vintage cans, so like all vintage tin. So this is like gonna be, oh dear God. Cool. If you look at a picture of a vintage tin, this is like kind of the thing you'd expect. So it's like a color that like more or less wraps around the outside. So I'd like to try to recreate as seamless of a texture as I can here, so that when I do UVs, I'm not gonna have to fight with them to make these edges sort of blend together, if that makes sense. Also, can we just talk about how awesome vintage tins are really quick? Like, what? These are so weird. I spent like 2 hours looking at pictures of vintage tins yesterday. It's ridiculous. Anyway, so basically my goal when I do this is like, again, I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna stitch all these edges here together. I'm just finding anywhere there's a seam, and I'll go to cut and sew, move and sew, and you can see that it totally stitches stuff together. Like, I have things that are more solid shells now. It's also making these really strange, like, long lines. That's just, like, all the stuff, like, on the sides, like these little guys here, that is just stitching those together. And sometimes it does this really nicely, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm just going to keep going through and, going to cut and sew, move and sew. And you can see that now I have more or less, like, here's like the front of my tin, here's the inside of my tin, and basically wraps around the entire tin so that there's only UVs on one of these corners. Does that make sense? Cool. So ideally, what I would also like to do is go through and, like, you know, seam this part together up here. So you'll notice, like, if I grab this edge here, and this is gonna break the crap out of my UVs. So if I move and sew this together, it's gonna do this, which is totally what we want. This is an example of amazing UVing. Please note the sarcasm in my voice. The reason that it does that is because none of these edges on this little top piece here, so if I select this UV shell, you'll notice that it's a single solid square. So when I try to stitch this, it's basically just attaching this square. What I would need to do to make this actually work the way I want it to is actually just cut these little edges in here. So I'm just going to select this entire edge and choose this as like my ugly sacrificial seam edge. I'll just go to cut and sew, cut, and you can see that there is now a seam in here. So if I were now to click on this edge here, and I'll just do this edge at the same time, and go to move and sew, it still does weird stuff, but now if I select the shell, because I have this cut in here, you can actually, example of bad UVing right here, and texture stretching, things to avoid in your models. Anywho. So if I select the shell here, I can now go to modify, unfold, and it will give me something that's like more or less straight. And you can see now, I mean, there's like a little bit of, like, this texture is no longer totally straight, but like, since we're going to be designing custom textures for the outside of this, we can pretty much make that so it doesn't matter in Photoshop just by the way we modify the texture. I actually, I'm pretty sure the video hasn't uploaded yet, but if you want to see kind of a different workflow to get super, super straight UVs on this, you can check that out later. I'll post that with the class tutorials when I send those out, or you can just creep on my YouTube channel. So does any questions about how we got the outside of this looking the way it is? All right. So in this case, I'm also going to go down to this little guy in here, and you'll notice that it's kind of like just awful with UVs. Like down, Maya on automatic mapping doesn't do super friendly things with just giant, like really tight corners like this. So again, what I'm going to do, I just want to make sure, so here's like my ugly seam corner. I'm just going to go through and like stitch all of these little pieces together. So again, just cut and sew, and I'll just do move and sew. And I believe I actually splice this on to the bottom. Yeah, okay, cool. That was actually, let's try it. Let's see what I just did. I'm actually curious how this is going to turn out. Hey, all right, I'll take that. So basically what I did here is I sewed the entire bottom of the piece so that I have UVs that wrap from all the way down from the bottom in here, and they just pretty much wrap up over the sides like this. And I'm not going to lie, I think I actually like this more than what I did this morning, so I'm going to keep them like this. I will just sew this last little corner together. I'll just grab the UVs, sew them together, and then grab the shell and do another modify unfold. And it just straightens out that corner a little bit. One thing that'll also make my life easier is if I just turn this UV so it's like kind of squarish, or like kind of, so it's not like super crazy diagonally. It's like, it just makes it easier to pack all the UVs in later. So you can see now I actually have like pretty darn nice UVs along the bottom of this object here. And then on the inside of this model, I just need to go through and basically do the same thing as I did on the outside. I'll just like grab these guys here, and I just want to I want one single piece of UV, like I have for this outside here, where it goes over like this little bump, and it's just like pretty much stretches that out. I want the same thing for the inside, so I'm just going to go through again and click on these edges in here, and if I will do another move and sew. And since I cut that ugly sort of seam edge, I should be able to unfold this without problems. Huzzah. And I now have the glorious inside of this tin can. Oh yeah. And I should probably also attach the bottom of the can. That does seem like a reasonable thing to do. So I'll grab, I realize like here's this little shell here is like this very, very top edge of the piece. I just forgot to attach that. So again, I'll just move and sew, and then I'm just gonna, I don't want that, all right, yeah, what the heck. And I'll just do another move and sew to attach the bottom piece of here. I just sort of arbitrarily picked an edge, and I'm like, cool, go there. So now if I grab the UV shell and I go to modify and fold, I'm like, cool, I have all of the inside sides of my shell, and then the bottom attached in more or less as few seams as possible. If I wanted to, I could also go through and attach, like I could sew these guys in here together, and, you know, just fewer seams. So any questions about that? Cool. So now what I'm left with is this awkward sort of thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure, so like if you look at the size of the grid itself on the bottom of this piece compared to the side, you'll notice that these squares are much smaller. So what I'm going to do is adjust the size of the shells to basically get all the UVs to be a more similar shape to each other. So I'll grab this and I'll scale it down. So by scaling this shell down, it's basically taking a smaller area of this texture, in this case the yellow square over the F. So it's grabbing a smaller area of texture and stretching it onto a larger surface, which is why when I scale the shell down, the grid size gets larger. Does that make sense? Cool. So once I have those being like kind of maybe looking the same size, I'm going to call that good enough. I'm just going to go through, and so for the sake of argument, I'm going to do a UV layout, modify layout. Actually, the one time it does actually a good job. This is pretty much what I was going to do manually, but now it's done it automatically. The only thing that I'm going to do, and again, this is purely to make life easier for texturing. Since I have this extra space up here, I'm just going to drag this like top bit up, and I'll separate this ever so slightly, and this is just going to make it easier when I need to go into Photoshop. I have a little bit of wiggle room to play with around the textures, so I don't accidentally add color somewhere I don't want to. And the reason that I actually chose to leave, so you'll notice like this shell, this actually wraps around the bottom outside of this object, and that's just partly because of the way that these cans are usually built. So like if I pull up this glorious Have a Coffee can, you'll notice, it might be kind of hard to see, but like you'll notice this little edge at the bottom. A lot of times these cans are made, I think, they'll take basically a single sheet of metal, wrap it around, and then they'll crimp it on the bottom with another piece of metal. And that's how they like attach the bottom piece on. So I left the UV separate since this is pretty much never textured. It's always like the default base color of the can. And so is the bottom of the can. So I figured if this was a separate UV shell, I could just make this all metal color and call it a day. I don't need to do a lot of extra hoops to make that a separate color. So does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? Unless people want to see me do the lid, it's pretty much the same process as the bottom. Yeah, so does anyone want to see me do the lid of this can? All right. In that case, I'm just going to leave this. You can see just really quick. So I have another edge of this like little sort of rolled metal bit here. So I did the same thing as the first one where I just wrap this in. I have this whole shell just wrapping over, and that'll just make texturing easier if I want to color this top a different color. But other than that, it's pretty much the same as the bottom of the can. All right, so if I wanted to texture this awesome looking can, I'll basically show you guys how to make like a custom label for your stuff. So just for something maybe like a color map and like a bump map, which adds like a little bit of bump texture to your stuff and helps give, if you have like fine detail, it'll help add that in without having to model it in, which I'll again show you later. So for the sake of keeping things interesting for myself, since I have to repeat this lecture like 3 times in a row, I did a super weird thing And I'm basically gonna make the label based off of like those dumb things where you're like, oh, give me like a number between 1 to 10 or whatever. Or like, when's your birthday month? Then you like pick a thing and combine a bunch of different things. And this is just gonna be what I put on the label for a demo. I don't know, I like being eccentric and weird. So can I get 5 numbers between 1 and 10? 8. 3. 2. 6. And one more? 1. All right. So we are going to be making a tin can for Harold's Best Citrus Coffee made with cheap teeth. I was waiting for that to get weird, and it didn't disappoint there at the end. Anywho, so I've also, just for grins, I made, like yesterday, some like weird labels. So do you guys like this label better or this one?
What's the first one? The second one?
Cool. Cool. Yeah, I'm like mad at myself. This like bulged out really horribly, and I'm like, I can fix it in Photoshop, and it still irritates me. All right, so if I were to open Photoshop, oh god, it's Creative Cloud Photoshop. This might be it. If they change the UI, it's gonna be real interesting, because I'm still running CS6 from the good old days before the subscription. Anywho. So the first thing that you want to do, usually, is export what's called a UV snapshot, which is basically Maya just showing you, it's like saves your UVs basically as an image, and then I can bring that into Photoshop so I can reference these UVs when I'm actually creating the texture. So if you go in your UV editor, go to Image, and UV snapshot at the bottom. For the love of God, do not save it as a Maya if. I've been saying this for years. I still don't know what Maya ifs are for. But anyway. So I usually just save it as a PNG. It'll give you transparency. So you don't need to like jump through a lot of hoops to actually see your UVs. I'll just set this to 496 because I'm feeling spazzy. UVs can. And you can save this like, so it'll default your UV snapshots to your images folder, but it really doesn't super matter where you put them. You can call them whatever you want. For the most part, the only settings I usually worry about that are like troublesome or relevant are the image size and the file format. So if I apply this and close, I will go back into my images folder here, and you can see that it's made this lovely UVs can texture. And you won't see anything here because my UVs are white and there's an alpha, so it's just displaying as white. If I take that and throw it into Photoshop, it will load slowly. Cool. Oh god. Oh god. No, I don't want to learn. Okay, so here's my UVs. I'm just going to label these UVs. And then I usually start by just throwing in like a black or colored background. So I can see what I'm doing. Yay. You can see that the UVs are now displayed gloriously in Photoshop. So now what I can do if I want to is I could come in and maybe be like, yeehaw. Make that white. Yeehaw. Cool. It's great, right? Awesome texture. So I'm just going to save this really quick and see what this actually gets me. I'm going to save can text. I'm just going to save this as a PNG in my source images folder. Be like, cool, whatever settings you need is fine. And then I'll just go through, assign this a new Arnold material. Just again, a standard surface shader. And I'm going to map in a file texture to the color. And I can actually select my PSD, which is super nice. You can see it pretty much maps my awesome yeehaw message onto my tin. And the nice thing about being able to do a PSD is like if I wanted to, I could come through and be like, awesome, I'm gonna draw like a random squiggle, huzzah. If I save this PSD, what? Interesting. Creative Cloud apparently doesn't like when you map PSDs into... Oh, that's so obnoxious. I'm actually really salty. So at least on the old versions of Photoshop, it would actually basically overwrite the file texture. And then if you just hit reload here, it would like show the new updated saved version with the like awful squiggle in it. But apparently that's no longer the case. I'm a little bummed, at least with Creative Cloud. But anywho, so if I theoretically, I'll just I modified the name and it can't find that file because it doesn't exist. I'll just save this. What? Wait. I have absolutely no idea. That's really weird. Alright, whatever. When in doubt, usually just... You can also do a thing and just save it as an image file. Bizarre. Cantex. Cool. So I'll just make Cantex PNG, save it, and go in and find my Cantex PNG, which should then have my horrible squiggle on it theoretically once it saves. Which might take a while because I did make this a very large texture. Alright. Alright, cool. So you can see I saved it as a PNG, I remapped it, and now it's on my can. That's actually really a shame because like that was like a huge benefit of doing PSDs. You could just like work with your file as you went, except this is... What are you open with? Okay, hang on. Because I'm actually not sure at this point what is using this file, so I'm just going to reopen Photoshop and reopen my file and see if that lets me save. 'Cause it seems like it's being glitchy at this point. But anywho, so while that's happening, so you can see that like my hideous text and squiggle have been mapped on, and if I go ahead and I turn on my texture in my UV editor, you can see exactly where the yeehaw is laid out. Oh, one other thing I actually meant to do, but didn't do. So I'm just going to say maybe I don't want this can to be square. If I wanted this to be rectangular, I can just do that really easily without... so you want to avoid scaling the object. And I go over this in my tutorial a little bit more specifically, but like if you just shrink this object down by scaling it, it's going to distort all of the nice sort of textures or like the little details you have along the edges here. But if you grab the UVs and shift them down, it won't distort the physical shape of the model. It will, however, do some weird stuff to your UVs. So I'm actually gonna go through and just do a mesh separate really quick. So like you'll notice, especially on the top of the can, where I scaled it down, like on these corners where the original UVs are, it's like nice and square. And on the inside, because I've modified the model but not the UVs, you can see that there's like some weird stretching here where the grid is now being kind of squashed together. If I wanted to go in and fix that, which I do, I would just grab these UVs here, and this is going to do the inside of the can. So I'll just grab these, and if I shift, whoops, that's the outside of the can. So if I shift these down a little bit to match, so that the UVs match sort of the shape of the can overall, I can then see that the texture stretching is pretty much fixed. And I can go through and again just do that to the bottom, where I just drag these UVs in and fix the texture stretching. Does that make sense? Cool. It's a relatively decent way. Like if you design a can like this in a way that it's like easy to shift vertices, it becomes fairly straightforward to go through and just like resize and like make a bunch of different variations of cans pretty quickly. So I'm actually just going to go through and correct the UVs for the sides of this as well. So for these, like I'm going to need to get, let's see, I'm just going to do, okay, so this is the inside of the can. Cool. Just going to grab every other side. Oh. All right. Wow, that is bad. I'm going to ignore that for now. You get the point. Alright, so that was actually... It is always weird going back in and like finding which sides you need to grab. Alright, so here's one. Cool. And as I do this, I'm also going to notice, or you're going to notice that it's like kind of causing some weird curving, so I'll just shift these down a little bit as well to kind of correct that as I go. And I'll shift this in as well. And huzzah, now I have like halfway decent kind of ish UVs. So I'm just actually going to do another UV snapshot with these updated maps. So image, UV snapshot, and I'm just going to apply this and overwrite my old texture. And now that Photoshop should be functional again, we shall see. I will just grab the UV scan images. I keep clicking on this expecting to see something. And cool. Hey, and you can see it's now updated. If I save this in my source images folder, I'm just going to overwrite the old file that I wrote. That's modeling. What the heck? Vintage 10. Source images. Yes. Please replace it. What? This is so questionable. Alright, cool. I'm actually starting to wonder if something was like possibly slightly corrupted with that original file. But, alright, so I'm going to just assign this my other texture, which had a weird yeehaw on it. I'm going to find can text. What did I just save that as? I saved it as UV's can PSD. Why naming is important. Where did I save this? Ugh, fine. Alright, I saved it in my images folder because I'm a dingus. Alright, so theoretically, if I make a squiggle on this, save it. Oh my god, why? Yeah, that's terrible that they got rid of that feature. Anyway, okay, cool. Okay, I'm actually, sorry. Real-time troubleshooting. Gets kind of awkward sometimes. Alright, cool. So I'll just show you how to go through and add in the textures to things. I'm going to do it without my cans. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to figure out, I actually already lit this scene, so I decided like this is going to be the front of my can. So if I select this face here, you'll see that it corresponds to this square on my UVs. So what I'm going to do is just go in, grab my weird design for the front of this tin, which I realize makes absolutely no sense at all with the shape of the tin, but that's okay. I'm just going to grab this and throw it into Photoshop with wild abandon. And I'm just going to scale this down for now and be like, cool, and maybe rotate it. So if I zoom in on this, you can sort of see where like where this label would fall if I were to actually apply this to the object itself. So in this case, I'm going to save this, and I'm going to bite the bullet and try to map this again. I can almost guarantee you it's not going to work, but yeah. So you can see that I have now this weird sort of texture positioned randomly on my can. So I'm just going to run through really quick, and I will. One reason I actually drew these like weird like pen drawings, like I just did these last night on pen and paper. Took a picture with my phone, and like I work like that a lot because it's, I don't know, for me personally, it's like really hard to draw this kind of thing in Photoshop. I just think it's counterintuitive. So I'll show you how I usually work with images if you want to like draw your own assets for stuff like that and then like convert it later, or like how I usually do it. So if I look at, so like looking at this, it looks like my label is not quite centered. And you can kind of use these like UV lines here as a guide to help you lay out the object. So like right now you can see it's not straight with this line up here, and it's like coming off this side a little bit. So I'm just going to translate this and maybe pull this over a little bit over here and perhaps scale it up a little bit and cool. And it's not going to let me save it? Yeah, okay. That's what I figured. God, is. I think I might, you know what, I'm just gonna do a really awkward thing and just keep overwriting my file textures. Or not. Wow. This is very annoying. Yeah, save that PNG. Alright, while that's doing things, I'm just gonna label this can text. Text is just my shorthand for texture. And if I'm just gonna manually change, it's like same name, it's just a PNG instead of a PSD, so I'm just gonna manually change that file path. And then it should update once the PNG is actually saved. You'll see it saved, and now it's updated. So does that make sense how I'm just sort of like going through and like keep twiddling with the positioning until you get something you like on the can? Cool. So, I mean, that's pretty much like how you texture with UVs. You just like tack things on until you like the shape. And then usually before I get like super deep into creating all my different texture maps, again, I'll show you that in a sec, but I'll just like go through with like the color and just make sure that the layout of everything is good and it's like showing up properly on my model. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to go through and move like 80 billion different layers, and that's just like really irritating. So what color are we gonna say the base of this can is gonna be? Anyone have a preference for a random color scheme? I like it. I heard orange, so I'm going with orange for the base color of this can. How do you feel about this ugly tangerine color? Fantastic. It's like a sunrise vomited on Maya on Photoshop. So a lot of times what I usually do if I just have a black and white image like this, I'll just set this to multiply and see, yeah, so clearly this is not like an actual grayscale image. I do tend to work slightly destructively when I'm in Photoshop because I'm bad. So for like something relatively quick like this, I'm just gonna rasterize this, go to my levels, and that's not what I want. What am I doing? Yeah. And then I'll pretty much just like crush these values down until I get like a more or less black and white image. I realize this is like a gross way to do things, but you get the point. So now I have like a nice outline on my colors. You can see by doing that, it makes it like a little bit, it can get it like a little pixely and weird around the edges, but for the sake of right now, yeah. So, alright, so now I'm just gonna throw in some text in there for whatever we happen to be making here, which is Harold's Best. Anyone have a preference for word color?
Red.
Oh God. I'm gonna embrace that instruction to make this red. It's gonna be awesome. Alright, this is gonna be Harold's Best. Anyone have a font they feel particularly What? Oh God. You're all terrible people. I actually, so funny story, I have 3D printers, and my roommate does, what the heck, my roommate does web design for a living, and he's like, yeah, print me a new frame for my glasses that says yo on the side, and I'm like, cool, so I put it in Comic Sans, and he's like, oh my God, I love it, it's such a bad, great joke. Anywho, cool, so we have Harold's Best Comic Sans, what are we making? Citrus coffee. Citrus coffee. This is 100% not gonna be graphic design at all. Everyone's always like, why didn't you go into graphic design? And I'm like, because I suck at it.
I was gonna say, just leave the citrus coffee small and in the corner of the sun.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm mostly just like doing a demo. This can be super ugly. Do we want this a different color? Or not? Okay.
Need some blue, we got all the primary going on.
Alright. I heard blue first. I'm kind of embracing the primary colors for this. Absolutely. Oh God, I hate doing. Does anyone know how to do curved text in Photoshop?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Wait, JK, that's Illustrator.
Yeah, like Illustrator has like the awesome like type on curve tool.
If I remember correctly, there's like a specific force text thing you can right click.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Can we make the third thing that you're typing out in Papyrus?
Hell yes. Oh, I feel so strongly about Papyrus. I actually do like Papyrus, but I do get angry when I drive down the street and see like every restaurant's name written in Papyrus.
I was attacked a while ago because it turned out my father's business that I worked for years. Apparently, the company logo and the company font was in Papyrus, and I didn't realize it.
Nice. That's ridiculous.
I just have work shirts that just have Papyrus.
Dang.
It's upsetting to realize.
Wait. I feel like there's like a thing up here perhaps. I don't know. You get the point. I don't know. This isn't a Photoshop class, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time with that, but I'll figure it out later. Cool. Harold's Best citrus coffee made with cheap teeth. Solid branding. So if I were to then go back and wait, but guys, we're going with primary colors. This needs to be bright yellow. It has to happen. This is gonna be so bad. If like you go home and you're like, what did you guys do in class today? Be like, I don't. Why did this happen? Yes. Cool. So I would highly recommend when you guys are working in Maya, see if your Maya won't, if it'll actually accept images, or like if you save and overwrite an image while it's pulled up in Maya, if it can do that, it's a super awesome, powerful tool. This Maya is just gross. So cool. Here's our super awesome looking can. One thing I literally always forget to do, as I always forget to turn off this stupid UV checker awfulness. I'll just toggle that. Like, you need it in Photoshop to see where your stuff is actually on your texture. Turn it off before you save it. I might also go through and just, oh wait, you said you wanted the last one, Papyrus. I'm sorry. No, it's fine. I like Papyrus. Papyrus regular. Beautiful. Oh, that makes it so good to read there. One of the things that I do a lot, probably more than I should if I'm adding textures to stuff like this, is like I'm just gonna go through and like add a random drop shadow. Or I'm sorry, I'm gonna add a random outer glow in the same texture as the same color as the background. And if I make this larger and totally opaque and set this to normal, it will outline my text, which if this were black, it would not stand out super well against the background, and this is just like my really gross cheating way to kind of add a slight texture to that if you need to. Cough. What?
Could you just aggressively emboss the
Oh, don't worry. You can do that in Maya. We're getting it's gonna be great. But yes, I do love aggressively embossing. So actually, speaking now that since you brought up embossing, that actually brings up a good point. If you're working with if you're doing something in like Photoshop, and you're just doing a 2D image or whatever, and you're trying to like emboss it to get that 3D effect, you totally do that in Photoshop. But once you add a bump map in Maya, it's kind of like think of it as Maya's version of embossing a little bit. It just has more capability. But that's like totally something I'm going to show you guys how to do in Maya, and it's going to be awesome. Nice. It's going to be, you should set that as your profile picture for like everything ever. Anyway, so, all right, so once that's done, I'm going to resave. Hopefully it'll actually, it's totally not going to overwrite it. I don't know why I keep trying this. Yeah, okay. This makes the workflow like immediately awful as soon as you have to like save a new file every time you want to do anything. All right, so here's my can texture. I'm gonna just go into my color texture again, update it to my newest file. That will eventually load. Yep, thank you. I'm like, why isn't it loading? Because I suck at typing. Hey, all right, so we have a thing now. The one thing actually I also realized, I'm like, oh yeah, the inside of the can probably isn't going to be this like weird tangerine color. So I'll just go through really quick and turn on my UVs again. And in this case, I'm just going to take text, cool, and color. Alright, so I'm just going to make a new layer, grab the entire bottom half of this piece, and what are we feeling? Are we feeling like a coppery bronze or a silver? This is going to be a really awkward can. I don't know what color copper is, guys. We're gonna call this copper colored. Ah, yes. I should probably move this above my other layer. Oh, this is gonna be gorgeous. Because it's not already. Just to be clear, I feel very strongly about how good this looks. Anyway, so I'm going to again just save this as another PNG. Literally worst workflow ever. Creative Cloud is evil. I am now convinced of this. Not only is it subscription, but it is also making my Maya workflow more inefficient. Anyway, so that'll upload eventually. And I've also set up, so I've set up a little bit of lighting in this, so I'm just gonna really quick show you guys what I have for that. Blah, blah, blah. I've been trying to force myself to use the Arnold render view, and it's actually kind of nice. So here's the hideous lighting I have set up with this awesome texture on the can. So one thing, like if you'll scroll in on this area, what if, imagine how much more glorious this can would be if this text was slightly indented off the surface. It's gonna be good. So for that you can do what's called a bump map, which is basically, I'll actually go through, so I'll label this canned. I thought I already did this. I thought I already labeled this texture. Weird. Anyway, so if you go down, I think mostly what I've showed you so far is like how to map like color and maybe a little bit of roughness. To do bump mapping in Arnold, you just need to go down. If you scroll down in your texture, there's this geometry tab. Under that, there's a little area for bump mapping. You just want to map the texture in the same way that you would normally. In this case, I'm going to put a checker texture on because checker textures are good for demos. So you'll see that once I do that, it does kind of put, you can sort of see that it makes like this weird sort of raised effect on my can. If I make that like really, really obnoxiously intense, you can see that it kind of adds these like odd lines in. Yeah. Sort of, kind of. Actually, is that just like super tiny? I realize it's like really tiny on the projector. But yeah, so you can see that that kind of like pops up in the render. If I did want to make the words look like raised text, what I could do. Bump maps work on a grayscale. So anything that is 50% gray is not going to have the height changed at all. Guys, what did I just do? This is not a hotkey. Wait. Alright, but actually, I don't know what I just pressed. Where did my menus go? Oh dear God. It's all good. What? Tab? Wait. Other tab? Ah, oh my God. Yes. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, like I said, I'm pretty sure that was not a thing in CS6, which is definitely what I'm used to. Anyway, so grayscale. Oh, that's what I see. That's obnoxious. So if I set this to 50% gray, this pretty much won't affect the bump at all. If I put this into Maya, the image would render just as it normally would. So values that are closer to black are going to appear indented or like pressed into your surface, and areas that are white are going to look like they're popping off of your surface. So if I'll just turn on my UVs really quick. So for the bump map, again, you usually want to start with this 50% gray texture, or gray color, and to get that, I'll just be like hue saturation to 0 and 50% for brightness. If I doodled on this with black, that's a and then I will do white. So just like as a really janky can bump one. Cool. So if I go back into Maya, and instead of mapping in this weird checker texture, I'm going to break this connection, remap a new file into this, because I actually have a file now, and I will find my can bump texture, can bump 1. So when I apply that, it should, once it eventually loads, yeah, so you can see it's like kind of the super awkward version of embossing in Photoshop a little bit, where I wrote black, it looks like it's a little bit like pushed into the surface, and where I have white, it's sort of coming up off of the surface. Does that make sense? Cool. So I can set, usually, most times when you make a bump map, 1 is going to be way too extreme looking. So a lot of times you'll actually have to bump the intensity down quite significantly. And yeah, I mean, you can get as low as you want with this. For the purposes of like, you can make it really obnoxious. Like if I set this to 5, it kind of makes it look darker.
Can you see out 5?
Can you see what?
Can you see out 5?
Oh, wait, like -5?
No, like, can you set it to a number of like 100?
Yes, although I'm not convinced it makes a huge difference. Yeah, I mean, that like honestly doesn't, yeah. That's honestly kind of disappointing. But all this is doing, so basically what a bump map is doing is just, if you switch this to -1, it reverses your bump map. But yeah, so all this is doing is it's pretty much kind of like faking. So remember when I explained like what normals are? How they show the front of your object? Or the front of your face. They also, so you can add what's called a normal map, which I think I still have pulled up. Z? That's bad. All right. So they have what's called normal maps. Sure, Bing. And it's pretty much anytime you have a normal map, it's going to be like these weird purple colors. And this is actually a way to map or control normals. Like you could apply this to your object and have the normals appear differently. And it's similar to a bump map. It's a little better than a bump map, but it's really annoying to actually apply in our world. So for this week, we're just going to stick to bumps. But normal maps are really, really good. But again, just like the same thing with color, roughness, specularity, you can control the normals with this normal map in the same way that you can control all of the other attributes. And basically the way this works is just like anything facing the y-axis is going to be colored with green, anything facing z is blue, and red is purple. So it just sort of, I don't know, the computer knows how to interpret this in a logical way. But if you ever see something that's like this weird sort of purpley green color, it's a normal map. I don't know, I think they're cool looking. But yeah, but I mean, bump maps kind of work in a similar way to the emboss tool in Photoshop, basically, where it just kind of tries to make the texture applied, or like it like fakes depth basically in your render. So you'll notice like if I rotate this around, the settings of like where the shadows are will kind of change a little bit. And it's like, I don't know, bump maps are cool. One thing you will notice though is if I, stop this really quick. So if I zoom in, like if I get really, really close up in here, I'm trying to get like aggressively close to the center of this, or like the side of this. So you'll notice that even though the bump maps are just an illusion, like they don't actually change the surface of your model at all. They just sort of make the render look slightly different. So you definitely would not want to use these for like major, like, structural pieces of your model. Like if you were modeling a phone, and you wanted to put like a phone jack in it, you should model that hole in because that is a very, very deep hole. And a bump map is not going to replicate that same deep hole effect. Does that make sense? All right. What bump maps are really good for is if you have something like, maybe you're modeling like a microphone or a speaker or something like that. You just have like that sort of fine mesh or like fabric on it. Bump maps are really good for that kind of subtle shape. That would be just ridiculous to actually model in by hand. So that's usually why you'd use bump maps. In the case of actually working on this Harold's Best citrus coffee made with cheap teeth, I'm going to, I'm just going to scribble back over this. And what I'm going to do is actually just grab my text from this original layer, alt drag it up to here. I'm going to turn off the glow on it because I just don't really care about the glow. And then usually what I do, if I need to recolor text, so this is why, like remember earlier when I was like, yeah, you should totally get your positioning of your stuff down, like your positioning of your text before you go back and tweak all of the other maps. Because I'm basically just going to be duplicating this text a few times. And if I go back and want to change the position later, I'm going to have to select all of the texts and like move them across all of my different layers, which is kind of annoying. So in this case, I'm just going to say, cool, we want this text to be raised. So for raised text, quick, white or black? Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to make that raised as much as possible. One thing I will do sometimes with, actually, okay, so I'll save this, and can bump to. I'm so glad I'm gonna have all of these textures immortalized on my flash drive forever. That's exciting. All right, so I'm gonna go in, find the actual bump I just made. Bump to. Cool. And then theoretically that should load, and now all of my text should be embossed in a super glorious looking fashion. Now again, you'll notice that this is pretty gross and pixelated looking. Bump maps I find bump maps to be really bad about that if you have sort of this, like, if you just go for like straight white bumest. But like bump maps will totally get like kind of weird and pixelated around the edges. And part of the other reason for that is because I am actually using, like, this texture is kind of small on this overall UV texture map, or like this texture file. So like if I look at, this is like a 4K image. This like Harold's Best citrus coffee thing is only taking up a small piece of that. So whatever I put on here is going to end up looking pixely if I zoom in like super far on it, because it's not using this entire texture map. Make sense? Cool. So this is like one of those instances where it might have actually made sense to go in and modify my UVs. Like if since I know I was gonna put most of my textures on this piece here, I could have grabbed this UV shell and made it significantly larger, so that it would occupy more of the texture space, and I wouldn't need to use as high resolution of an image to get the quality that I was looking for. But in this case, I've already started, so we're gonna keep going. So the one thing, again, if you look at this and it's like kind of pixely and kind of like a really hard edge, usually my way to fudge like a softer text in Photoshop is to add an inner glow to it. I don't know, this is like as fake procedural as you get. So I'm just gonna eyedropper, I just want it to fade into the background. And I'll just sort of set this to normal, opacity to 100. And sort of twiddle the settings. So if I did something more like this, it's gonna be a lot softer of a bump. And it pretty much actually obliterates the bump on the bottom, which I think I'd be okay with. So if I save this, go through PNG. Huzzah. And then once again, go back to Maya, find my texture. I'm just going to change this to 3. So you'll notice, like, once that ever gets around to loading, it just changes the effect of the bump and it makes it appear a little bit more like a kind of interesting harder bevel. But like this totally is basically just embossing in Photoshop. You just do it in Maya. So that's kind of a bump map. One thing that you can do, scratch text. You can also use bump maps. Are really good for like scratches. So like if I were to go to Google and grab this incredibly low resolution scratch picture, save that somewhere in the flash drive. Scratches. If I wanted to, I could take that and throw it into Photoshop. This is going to look absolutely terrible, just for the record. But I'm just going to set this to multiply because I just want these black scratches in here. And again, this is going to look really janky. So this is actually an example. So I'm going to save this as just like the straight black image, just to show you like how aggressive bump maps can be. The one thing to kind of keep in mind with bump maps is, since they aren't creating actual variation in the texture of your surface, it's not a bad idea to be a little bit sparing with them. Like, clearly this is ridiculously dark looking. Like, this does not look at all realistic. So what you want to do, so you'll, if I go into my bump, you just click around. If you click around in here, you can go back and find the bump depth. I'll set this to 1. You can see 1 is already infinitely better than 17, which is for some reason what I had it set before. But something more like maybe 0.1, okay, that's, or 0.1, sorry. Something more like 0.1 maybe looks a little bit more realistic for these scratches. Where you just want it to be, you know, a really, actually I don't even know, can you see that on the projector? That's not helping. But you just want it to be like a really subtle effect. It doesn't need to be like, you know, someone tried to take a machete to your tin and like chop paint off. With bumps, a lot of times subtle is kind of more effective and less jarring looking. You'll notice, so like even at 0.1, the sort of Harold's Best texture still has a reasonably not terrible, slightly raised effect to it. It's just not as ridiculously garish as it was before. So in this case, I'm going to set this back to 1 for grins. And I'm going to go in Photoshop and just modify this. In this case, I'm just going to turn the opacity way down to maybe something like this. Like this is actually something that like Maya, okay, I'm going to make it a little darker because the projector. But like this is something that Maya will totally pick up, even if it's not really obvious to your eyes. Maya does a great job of accentuating all of the weird stuff in your bump maps, for better or worse. So again, I'm just going to change this. All right. And you'll notice, it might be kind of hard to see on the projector, but you'll notice, like, so now I still have the nice deep bumps on this Harold's text up here, but my scratches are much, much subtler. So that's, again, just something that you need to modify in Photoshop and not necessarily with the slider, depending on the values that you want. You will also notice that, like, if I look in the viewport, like, these scratches are ridiculous looking, and in the render, they're much, much more subtle. So that's just something, again, to be aware of, that the viewport does not necessarily reflect what your renders are going to look like. You need to actually render to see what your renders will look like. I don't know. When I was first starting Maya, I was like, oh, the viewport's totally accurate, right? And then I'm like, oh god, no, it's not. I'd render it and everything would look terrible. So any questions on that so far? All right then. So, usually, so like, okay, so mostly the three things that I actually pay attention to when I'm doing things are like color, bump, roughness, and sometimes metalness. So I'll just go through and show you guys how to maybe make some stuff for the metal texture and map the roughness a little bit. So I'm gonna grab all this and call this bump. You will notice that so like on my bump texture in Photoshop, I do have the scratches in here. I didn't necessarily show them in the color. You could if you want. So like there's certain, like if you were going for like a piece of metal with paint and the paint had chipped off, you could totally like map that into your color channel and all the rest of them and make it look like a separate material underneath. I'm just not doing that for this particular demonstration, but you could if you wanted to. And again, stop me with any questions. The assignment for this week is to pretty much take an object, and I'll go over this more later, but take an object and map in at least 2 file textures into 2 different channels. So you could do like color and bump, you could do color and roughness, you could do roughness and bump if you want and not do color. Yep.
Can you just explain why you use that color?
Say what?
The gray color, for example?
Oh yeah, so the gray color on the background of the bump map, this 50% neutral gray is basically, Maya reads that as don't do anything to this. So don't make it look indented, don't make it look raised. This is just, that's like kind of flat for Maya. So anything that's closer to black is going to appear recessed or dented in, and anything closer to white is going to look raised or embossed.
You say 50, right?
50%, yeah. Yeah, 50% by value. So if you go into, click into your color, you just want to set the brightness to 50% and hue and saturation to 0. Interestingly, apparently 18% gray is what looks, this is what looks 50% gray to the human eye, but it is not. Anywho, so, okay. All right, so if I wanted to go in and map, say, I have my color, I'm gonna stop this weird render. So what I'm gonna shoot for is having this maybe look like a plastic label or something thereabouts, and this bottom part look like a weird coppery metal color. You'll also notice that the inside of this tin is also this weird coppery color, as per the texture I've made in Photoshop for it. So what I'm gonna do is just go through and map some metalness onto this really quick. No idea what this is gonna do. So in this case, the only place that I really want this to look metal is at the bottom where my metal is. So the easiest thing to do for this is probably just to grab these 2 layers, alt copy them, group them, metal, and then so a value of 0 is going to give me not metal at all, and a value of 1 is going to give me super metal and reflective looking. So all I'm going to do here is just go through and set this bottom piece to be, so the bottom piece was like the little curls of metal at the bottom. I want that to be white, I want that to be super metal. And then this black back color, I'm going to make black. And huzzah, I now have a metal map. One thing I could do actually, if I wanted to, like I could come up here and grab these scratches. And if I invert the, that's actually not what I want. Set this to normal and more opacity. All right, cool. So here's my scratches. I just inverted the texture, set it back to normal so it's not multiplying. So this should theoretically give me like metallic looking chunks in the middle of my label. Again, I'm being incredibly unartful with this. Cool. All right, so, save. All right, so I'm gonna go back into my render view here. I'm gonna play that render. I think I can afford renders that are more than 300 pixels big. I think this computer can handle that. My laptop cannot at all. All right, render view. And play. All right. Oh wow, that's already better. All right, so if I go back into my can texture, again, I'll just go to the metalness channel and map in a file texture. I will find my can metal texture 1, grab it, and throw it in. Oh, that's hideous. I'm not gonna lie, I think it's kind of cool looking, but not quite what I was going for. I think what happened is, because this is totally being affected by that, and it shouldn't be, what might be happening is that I need to select alpha as luminance. So if I go down to, this is under my file node, like where I select the file texture, go down to color balance, and theoretically, yeah. So if I check alpha as luminance, it fixes that problem. If you ever import a texture and find that you're having stupid problems with it, try checking alpha as luminance. Again, in the window where you import your file texture, under color balance, little tick box, many times fixes things. So anyway, so you can see now that I have like an actual something that isn't metal here, and then this little inner piece is super metal looking. If I were to hide the top of that can, ooh, that's actually kind of pretty. You can see this like nice sort of metal-y effect in the inside of the, on the inside of this can as well. You get like the nice reflections and stuff in there. So any questions on anything I've done so far? Cool. What have I done? Yes, I'm scrolling. I'm sure you guys have, like, if you haven't already, I'm sure you guys are totally going to get to that point where you're like, I am moving between so many different programs and all of the controls and hotkeys are different. What am I doing right now? Anywho. So another thing that I, not always, but often like to do, sometimes, is go through, sometimes I'll actually go through, like, I might actually make the text kind of metal-y, and that's mostly just because, like, I don't know if you guys have noticed, like, every once in a while, like, if you get, like a cool card or something like that, they'll put, like, a little metal foil over the text. So you can replicate that again just by adding, like, I'll just throw my, so good. I'm just gonna go through this, and I'm being lazy, so I'm just gonna apply a color overlay of 1 to this to make my text white. Excuse me. So now if I save this, and re-upload it to Maya, it should make my text appear metallic if that is something that I want. You could also, one other thing that I'll sometimes do is I'll adjust like the roughness. If you make the, if you can make the can like really rough and then have the text be kind of shinier is often an interesting effect you can do. Anywho, just gonna remap that real quick and cool. And you can see my text is now like weird and metallic looking. If I scroll in, it's like, kind of looks terrible. That's actually probably because my bump map is way too extreme and it's just like, I can't process this. So theoretically, if I were to go down to my geometry tab, I could mod that bump map and maybe set this to like 0.5, 0.1. Yeah, it kind of makes it, so like once you apply metalness, like that seems to make the bump map go a little bit more haywire looking. So you can just adjust your bump map and that'll kind of tweak that. And you can see, so I also put the, I also had the metalness in my scratch texture, and you can see that that actually darkens the scratch texture a lot. So like if I set this bump map to 0, pretty much just turning off the bump map temporarily, you can see that just by applying the metalness to this, to the scratch texture, it is actually making those scratches show up and appear darker because of the way that light is reflecting off of them. So I mean, that's pretty much, that's more or less like applying a texture map in Maya. And making different channels for stuff. So does anyone have any questions about this? Or like anything we've done so far with texturing? Alright. In that case, I'm going